Hello everybody, welcome to part 1 of creating this simple authentication app using TypeScript React for the front end and Go for the back end using the Gin framework. So in this part, I'll be creating the back end using the Gin framework, just as I said, and create endpoints for API/register, login, getting the user, and logout. I'll be using Mysql for database and incorporating Json web token for authentication and add a middleware to resolve CORS policy error. So in case you don't know what CORS is, it stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, and I'll be going over that later in this video. But if you're interested, you can pause the video and watch this real quick. Read that real quick. So let's get started. I always want to get started with creating a repo in GitHub. I'm going to name my repo go/react auth demo. I'm going to make it public and not add a readme file or git ignore, and just create repo. And it's going to tell you how you can initialize your Git in the local project. So I'm going to come back out here, and if it's your first time creating a Go project, once you install Go, you're going to realize how you have a Go path configured for you. So that's going to be inside your home directory, and you would want to create directories like this: source github.com, and put your username there, and -p is going to create all the folders leading up to the last one here. So once you create that, you're going to cd into that, enter, and here I want to create this directory that matches the name of your repo. So make dir go react auth demo, cd into that, and then open that up in Visual Studio Code. So if you don't have that shortcut to open up Visual Studio Code from the terminal, just do Command-Shift-P from your Visual Studio Code and look for shell command install code command and path, and just enter, and that shortcut is going to work for you. So here I would do Command-J to open up the terminal. So the first thing I want to do is to initialize Git. So I'm going to copy this first line and paste it here. This is going to create a readme file in my project, and just copy line by line to do git init, and then I'm going to create my first commit. Actually, I want to add this readme file, stage it, and then make my first commit and say it's going to be my first commit, and then make main as my main branch, and come back here and then add the link to this remote repository we created, and lastly copy this last line to push our change to the remote repository. So if you come back here and refresh, you're going to realize how the readme file has been pushed. So now that we have Git initialized, I want to create a folder called Backend and create my main.go file in there. And main.go is always the first file that we want to create, because this is the executable file where everything will be executed. So here I'm going to name my package main, and that's by default, and create a function called main. And here I'm going to call a function start application from the app package, which I'll be creating in the backend folder. So inside backend folder, create app/application.go, and that's going to create app folder, which is our package, and then create the file within it. I always want to specify my package and then create my function called start application. In here, I want to define my router, and I want to create my router using the Gin framework. So simply just Google Gin framework or something, and then come to this repo, and it's going to tell you how you can install. So copy that first line there, copy this one, come back and just paste it here. And that's gonna do its thing. While it's doing its thing, I'm gonna create a variable called router, and I can do that by doing gin.default. And everything is inside this documentation if you want to refer to anything. So do gin.default, and on this router we can call our request, get or post, and then do a run on the port that we specify. So back in application.go, I'm going to do router.run and say I want to run this on port 8081. So I'm going to save this, and this is going to automatically import the gin from GitHub. And then if I save this, it's going to call the app package that we just created there. In here, I also want to call map URLs, which I'm going to be creating within the same package app. So here, I want to create router.go, and as usual, name my package and create this func map URLs. Save this real quick, come back to application.go and save it. And since this function is created within the same package app, you don't have to worry about the scope. In other words, we can access router that we created here in application.go and create post and specify the endpoint that we will be creating. And here I want to call users.register, and this is gonna be our controller, and this is the register function that we will be creating in the users controller. So inside the backend folder, I'm gonna create controller/users/user controller.go. Again, the name of the package is going to be users because that's the parent folder of this file. In here, I want to create a function called register, and this is where we would be passing in the gin context. So if you look at the documentation, this is the part we're creating in the controller, and this receives a context, and we can send a response back using the context.json. If I save it, it's gonna auto import the gin framework. The first thing we want to do is create a variable called user of type user struct, which we have to create. Again, in the backend folder, I'm gonna create domain/users/users_dto.go. So data transfer object is what we are going to be using to pass data back and forth within the project, and this is where our user struct is going to be defined in. So again, I'm going to name my package users and create this struct called user. Here I'm going to have ID of type int64, first name of type string, last name of type string, password of type string, and email type string. And I also want to specify how each of these fields are going to be recognized in the JSON format, and this is going to help you later when you're interacting with the database. So I'm just going to do it right now while I'm making this. So only a small difference. JSON it's gonna be the same for the password, JSON colon, and just say email. Save it. Now back in the controller, if I save it, it's gonna auto import the user's package from the domain folder. And the first thing we want to do is c.shouldBind JSON and pass a pointer to this user. So what shouldBind JSON do is pass the data from the request body in the context and store this in a pointer to the user. And if you hover over it, you see how this returns an error. So I'm gonna do error like this and check if there is any error. And if you're new to Go, this first statement is gonna run first and return an error if there is one. And we're doing an if statement on the second part here based on the error that was returned. And if there is an error, I want to do c.json and pass an error, but you're going to realize how JSON takes in a code and an interface. So we want to create this REST error struct that will be used across the project. And it will make sense once I create it and show it to you. So in the backend folder, I'm going to create utils folder inside errors folder and create rest_error.go. Specify my package name, and here I want to create a struct called rest error, and this is going to have a message of type string, status of type int, and an error like this. And we're going to have two different types of errors that we want to handle for now, and of course we can create more along the way. And this returns a pointer to the rest error struct, and just return rest error like this, and the message is going to be the message that's passed in the parameter. Status is going to be HTTP status internal server error, and the error is going to be internal server error, and you need a comma here in the last field. Similarly, I'm going to create new bad request error and pass a message of type string, and this is going to return a pointer to the rest error that we created above. So this is very similar to the one we just created above. Here I want to pass the message. The status is going to be http.status bad request, and the error, it's going to be bad_request, comma, save it. So we now have the errors package that we can call from anywhere in the project. So back in the controller, I'm going to delete this for now. I'm going to call this package and do errors.new bad request error. And this automatically imports the errors package. And here I'm just going to say it's an invalid JSON body, and save this in a variable called error. And now I can do error.status and then pass in the error as an interface and do a return here so that we exit if there is an error. So having this errors package make handling errors easier for us, and we're going to be using this across the project again and again. So if we don't have any error, I want to call create user method from the services and pass in this user. So services is where we want to handle our business logics, and just like how we did before, I'm going to create services and create users service Go in here. Package services, and create a function called create user, and I'm going to be passing in the user struct, and it's going to return a pointer to the user and pointer to the rest error, like this. So save that. Okay, I'm going to come back to that later. The first thing I want to do is validate this user, and I don't have this validate function yet, and that's something I want to create in the data transfer object. So I'm going to create this function validate, and this is going to return a pointer to the rest error. And unlike the functions we created before, I want to specify a receiver for this function. And by specifying a receiver, this becomes a method and not a function. In here, I want to do strings.trim space and pass in the first name of the user and save it in the user.firstname. Save it. Same for the user.lastname. I want to do trim space and pass in user.lastname. User.email and do trim space and pass in user.email. And if the email is an empty string, I'm going to do bad request error and say it's an invalid email address. So I'm just keeping the validation simple for now, and you can modify to meet your needs. So user password like this, and if user password is an empty string, I'm going to return bad request error and just say it's an invalid password. And if everything goes well, I'm going to return nil. So save it. And back into services. Validate is going to return an error if there is one, and I want to handle that error like this. If there is, I'm just going to do nil error like this. And the next one we want to do is actually encrypt the password before we save that into the database. And I'm going to be doing Bcrypt to encrypt the password. So simply do Bcrypt enter, and that's going to auto import Bcrypt, and do generate from password. So generate from password takes a byte slice. So I'm going to parse user password into a slice of byte, and for cost I'm going to keep it at 14 and store this in a password slice and an error, and I'm going to check if there is any error and return errors dot new bad request error and just say failed to encrypt the password or something like that. And since the user that password is a string, I want to actually parse it back to string, and you can do it this way. And now that we have saved the encrypted password, I want to do user.save. And this save method is something we want to create in the data access object. And we will create data access object in the same package we created the data transfer object. So here, simply create users underscore data access object.go. And data access object is where we interact with the database, and this is where all our queries would be in. So again, I'm going to name my package and create this function called save, and this is going to return pointer to the REST error like this. And before I continue, I actually want to set up my connection to the database. So in here, I'm going to create a data source folder, MySQL folder, and create users DB and create users db.go inside it. Here, I'm going to name my package users_db and create a function init like this. We're using MySQL driver for our project. So simply just look for Go SQL driver / MySQL and just copy that first line here and paste it here to install it. Okay, and here I want to import and do underscore here and type that Go SQL driver MySQL like this. You need to have this underscore to ensure that this import stays in this file. And here I want to create a variable called client, and this is going to be a pointer to the SQL.db. And in here I'm going to do SQL.open and name it MySQL and pass the data source name in here, which we have to create. So I'm going to create this variable called data source name, and this follows a specific format where it has a username, password at TCP, and you pass in your host / and user schema. So this is the format that the data source name follows. So I'm going to create fmt sprintf and insert placeholders for the username, password, host, and user schema. Actually, I'm going to create those variables up here first so that it makes more sense to you. For me, the username is root, and I don't have the password set. And the host is going to be localhost 3306. And schema that I created is users db02. And for your information, I'm using Mysql Workbench to interact with the database. So if you have never used MySQL before, you can just install this Mysql Workbench and create a connection, specify your hostname and the port, your username, and set the password to something. And once you add the connection, you will have access here, and you can create a schema by creating this button right here. I'm going to zoom in for you. So create a new schema, and the name of the schema that I created is users db_02. Inside, I created a table called users, and these are the 5 different fields that I created inside the users table. And I also have some mock data in there, and it's up to you to create those. So back in the users DB, of course, this is not the proper way to store your username and password. You would want to store these credentials in a .env file and specify that .env file in your git ignore so that it doesn't get pushed to the remote repository. So I'm going to continue off with this data source name. So I have these 4 different placeholders for the username, password, host, and schema. So I'm going to just do add TCP, pass in this placeholder, and like this. And lastly, I want to do char set equals UTF-8. And then I can do password host schema. So with this formatting, we would be passing these 4 values into these 4 placeholders that we created here. And now, before I continue, I want to create this variable of type error. And SQL.open is going to return a client and an error. Save it. And the reason I want to create this variable error like this is because I already have this client defined up here, and I can't do dynamic assignment here because I already have a client defined. So I also wanted to define error and get rid of this dynamic assignment. So I'm going to handle the error real quick and do panic error if there is any. And if there isn't any error, I'm going to do client.ping. And what .ping do is just verifies the connection is made. And this is going to return an error if there is one. And I'm going to handle the error the same way and return panic. And lastly, I'm going to do log.println and say database successfully configured or something like that. So save it, and now we should have the database configured for us. So now that we have the database configured, I'm going to come back to the data access object. And here, I'm going to call that client variable that we created in users.db, and I'm going to call prepare method and pass a query insert user into the method, which we have to create. So variable up here and query insert user, and this is going to be insert into users table. Specify the column names, email, and password, where we would be passing in these 4 different values. So I'm going to save this real quick. And prepare returns a pointer to a statement and an error. And this creates a prepared statement for later queries or executions. So here I'm going to do statement error and handle that error. And return errors.new bad request error and simply say database error for now. And we always have to close the statement. So before I continue, I actually want to specify the receiver of this method, and it's going to be a pointer to the user. And once we have the statement without an error, I'm going to do statement.execute and pass in the first name, last name, email, and password. So these 4 values come from this pointer to the user. And this pointer to the user comes from the service here. And this is actually coming from the controller itself. And this pointer to the user stores the data that we have received from the request body. So by creating the user, we go to service and we want to save that, and we can access the data from the pointer to the user, and we are inserting those data into this statement. So by doing statement.execute, we're passing these 4 different values into this query that we created, and this would be passed into the database with the values inserted into these question marks. and this is going to return the data back to us from the database. So execute returns result and an error. So I'm going to call this insert result and save error like this. So handle that save error as usual and return errors dot new internal server error and just say database error. Actually, I want to call this new internal server error as well. Actually, get rid of this bracket right here. And the last thing we want to do is insert result dot last insert ID. And last insert ID returns an integer and an error, which is actually our user ID and an error. So the reason we want to do this is because the ID is auto-generated in the database when we pass in these values. And we actually want to call that ID that was auto-generated from the result, extracted, store it in user ID, and then store that manually in our user ID. Before that, we just want to handle the error like this. Return errors dot new internal server error and just say there is a database error. And if we reach this point, I'm just going to return nil. Save it. Now that the data access object is created, I'm going to come back up to the service. And user.save returns an error if there is one. And I'm going to handle that error and return nil in error. So if we reach the end without any error, I want to return a pointer to the user and nil like this. And save it. Move back up to the controller. Create user is going to return a result and an error. And I'm going to do save error not equals nil. And in the controller, I'll do c.json and call the status, pass the save error if there is one, and do a return. And lastly, if we don't have any error, I want to send status OK as a response and pass the result back to the user. And now that the controller function is created, I can save this users.register. It's going to auto import, and that's pretty much it for the register endpoint. So now that we have the database, data access object, and everything in place, everything else is going to be much easier, just that we have to implement JSON web token and everything like that. So let me actually just create all the endpoints right now. Login. Here I'm going to do users login, and this is going to be API user, where we'd be getting the user and passing the data to the home page. So we want to get the user information and display it in our home page. The last one is going to be logout, and this is going to be API/logout, and pass in the logout function from the user's controller. And I'm not going to save it for now until I create those functions in the controller. So I'm going to start from the login function, and inside the controller we always want to pass in the gin context as a parameter. And just like before, I'm going to create this user struct variable user and do c.should_bind JSON and pass in the pointer to this user struct. And this returns an error if there is one, and handle that error. Inside this, I'm going to create a variable error where I do errors.new bad request error and say it's an invalid JSON. And I can do c.json error.status and pass the error and do a return. And if we don't have any error, I can call get user from the service and pass in this user. I'm not going to save it. I'm just going to move to the service. And in our service, I want to create a function called get user and pass in this user struct. And this is going to return a pointer to the user and the rest error like this. So in our login function of the controller, we are using our email to log in. So I first want to create this variable called result, where it's a pointer to the user storing the value of the email from the user that's passed in. So pass in this email into the email field, and I want to do result.get here. So this get function is going to come from the data access object. In here, I first want to create my query. So just like I said, we are getting user by email. So we are doing select ID first name, last name, email, and password from users where email is unknown. So down here, I'm going to create this get by email. Actually, let's rename this to get by email, just because we are getting by ID later on. We want to distinguish the two. And this is going to return a pointer to the rest error. And here I want to specify that this is a method on the pointer to the user. So just like how we did above, we're going to call the db.client and do prepare and pass in that query that we created above. And this is going to return a statement and an error. If there is any error, I'm going to do errors.new internal server error and just say it's an invalid email. And I'm going to close that statement like this. And unlike how we did statement.execute above when we created user, I'm going to do query row and pass in the email. Query row returns, it executes a prepared statement and returns a pointer to the row. So this is going to return a pointer to the row, which I'm going to store in the result variable. And I'm going to do result.scan and pass in a pointer to the user ID, a pointer to the first name, last name, email, and password like this. So scan copies the columns from the matched row into the values pointed at by dest. So in other words, this statement.query row is going to return the row that we want from the database. And by doing a scan on the result, we are passing the data from the result into each of these fields based on the matching columns. So it copies the columns from the matched row. So you're going to have the data stored in the pointer to the user. And this is going to return an error if there is one. And to get error nil like this. Return error new internal server error and just say there is a database error. Actually, this has to be ID with capital D. And lastly, I'm going to return nil. Save it. So now that we have the data access object in place for getting the user by email, so this is going to return an error if there is one. And I'm going to handle that error as usual. So by doing get by email on this result, if we don't have any error, we're going to have access to the data in this variable, like the email, first name, ID, last name, password, etc. So since our password is encrypted using Bcrypt, we have to decrypt it back. We can decrypt a password by doing bcrypt dot compare hash and password. So compare hash and password takes in the hashed password from the database and the password that we have from the request body. So result is what we have from the database, and this user is what we have from the request body, which is from the user. And since this only receives a slice of byte, I'm going to parse the result password into a slice of byte, and same for the user, that password, like this. And this is going to return an error if there is one, and I'm going to do return nil errors.new bad request error, and just say failed to decrypt the password or something. And when we are returning the result back to the user, we don't want to include the password in there. So I'm going to create this variable and say it's without a password. Of course, you can name it however you want. And in here, I'm going to create the fields, pass in result.id. First name is going to be result.firstname. Last name is going to be result.lastname. Email is going to be result.email. Actually, this is users.user. And I'm going to return result without password as a response. Now that the service is in place, we can go back out to the controller. This returns a result and an error. If there is any error, I can do c.json and send this back to the user as a response and do a return. So here comes one of the most important part of authentication, where we would be creating JWT claims and token. So in order to create JSON web token in our project, I'm going to be using this JWT-Go, and I'm going to put that link in the description box for your reference. So simply include that in the import here. Of course, get rid of this HTTPS. Here I first want to create a claims variable, and I can do that by doing JWT.new with claims, and this returns a JWT.signing method, which is gonna be JWT.signing method. Yeah, let me just type it out. Signing method HS256, and then it takes in JWT.claims, and it's going to be JWT.standard claims, and inside the standard claims I'm going to pass in issuer, which is going to be a result ID that we have. But result.id is of type integer 64. So I first want to parse it into int and then do string convert dot itoa and wrap the entire thing up to convert it into a string. And then also specify when it's going to expire. And I'm just going to do time.now and add time.hour times 72.unix. Something like that. Save it. And claims is not used, which is why I still have that red line. And then I can do claims.signed string. And what signed string do is actually get the complete signed token using the secret key that we're passing in. So in here, I want to pass in our secret key, which can be anything, but I actually want to specify my secret key up here. So create a const secret key, and I'm just gonna do a random string as my secret key. So here I'm gonna pass the secret key in here as a slice of byte. So this is gonna return our token and an error, and I'm gonna check if there is any error. I can do, I'm gonna create a variable called error if there is any error, and just say errors.new internal server error, and say something like login failed. And inside our c.json, we're going to do error.status and pass in the error and do a return. And now that we have the token, I can create a cookie by doing c.setCookie from the context and pass in the name. I'm going to name this JWT. The value would be the token itself. The max age, I'm going to keep it at 3600. And for path, I'm going to do / localhost false for secure and true for HTTP only. And now that we have set the cookie, I can send the response back by doing status OK and putting the result there. Save it. So the login function is ready, and now this endpoint should work properly. And the next thing we want to do is getting the user information from the database using the ID in the session cookie. Down here, I'm going to create a function called get and pass in the gin context as usual. And here I want to retrieve the cookie with its name, JWT, and this is going to return cookie and an error if there is one. Of course, handle that error as usual, errors.new internal server error, and just say cannot retrieve cookie or something. And do c.json get error.status, get error, and do a return. And if we don't have any error, I want to do JWT.parse with claims, and this takes a token string, which is our cookie, and as its claims, I'm going to pass in a pointer to the standard claims. And lastly, it accepts a key func. So if we actually go into parse with claims and dive into the key func, it's an interface that accepts a pointer to a token and returns an interface and an error. So I just copied that. I'm simply gonna paste it here. And we actually have to specify that this token is from JWT like this. And this key func is going to return our secret key in a slice of byte form, secret key, and nil, like this. And this returns our token and error. And I'm going to handle that error for the 10th time. So here, I'm going to do errors that new internal server error, say error parsing cookie, and do c.json rest error.status and pass in the rest error and do return. So if we don't have any error retrieving the token, I want to do token.claims and store that claims in a variable that we created. But what we actually want to access is the issuer in the claims. But you're going to realize how we cannot access issuer from the claims. So if you look into the claims, you realize it's just an interface. And if you scroll down just a little bit, we realize how the issuer actually belongs to the standard claims struct and not the claims interface. So back here, I want to parse this into a standard claims, a pointer to the standard claims, by simply doing a dot and passing that in like that. And now our claims variable is going to be of type standard claims. And now I can access claims.issuer like this. And I actually want to parse this into an integer of type 64. So I'm going to do parse int of base 10 type 64. I'm going to save this in an issuer like this. So handle the error again, rest error, errors.new request error, user ID should be a number, c.json rest error.status and rest error and do return. So if you recall, the issuer has our result ID stored in it, which is why we want to access the issuer like that. So issuer is basically the ID of our user. And I want to do services get user by ID and pass in this issuer as its parameter. So inside the service, I'm going to scroll down and create a function get user by ID and pass in user ID of type integer 64. This is going to return a pointer to a user and a pointer to the rest error. Here I'm going to create a variable called result, and this is going to be a pointer to a user that stores the user ID in its ID field. And I'm going to do result.get by ID. So this is something we would create in the data access object. So inside data access object, I would start with query get user by ID. And this is going to be very similar to get user by email, just that we wouldn't be retrieving the password, and this would be ID instead of email. So scroll back down, and here I want to create get by ID, and this is going to return a pointer to the REST error. You should be used to it by now. And it's gonna have a receiver where it's a pointer to the user. And again, it's gonna be client.prepare and pass in that query that we just created. And it's gonna return a statement and an error. And we're gonna check if there is any error, new internal server error, and just say there's a database error. Defer statement.close. And if we don't have an error, we're going to do statement.queryRow and pass in the user ID that we have. And this is going to return a pointer to a row, just like what we had above. And then I'm going to do result.scan and pass in user ID, user first name, user last name, user.email, and that's actually it. And this is gonna return an error. If there is one, return okay. And return errors.new internal server error, and just say there is a database error. If there is any, return nil. If there isn't. So now that we have this in place, I'm going to move back up to the service, and this is going to return an error. I'm going to check the error. Okay, return nil error like this. Return result the nil. Save it. Then move back up to the controller. Get user by ID is gonna return a pointer to a user and a REST error. So I'm gonna say result and REST error. If REST error is there, I'm gonna actually see.json REST error .status and pass the REST error to a return. And if we don't have any error, I'm going to do c.json status okay and pass in the result as a response. Save it. And that's it for getting the user with ID. We have one last endpoint that we have to handle, and that's going to be the logout. And the logout is going to be the simplest of all. So in the controller, I'm going to create a function logout and pass in the gin context as usual. And in order to get rid of the cookie, we actually have to override that cookie using the same name, not passing anything. We want to set the max age to a negative value, set path to empty string, set domain to empty string, and just say false and true for these. And do c.json http status okay, and pass in a body with a message saying success. And that will get rid of the cookie that exists in the session. And that's pretty much it for logging out. And it seems like we're done with these 4 endpoints, but there's one thing that I pointed out in the beginning of this lecture, which is adding a middleware to resolve CORS policy error. So CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, and browsers restrict cross-origin requests for security reasons, and making a request to a different origin from frontend, which is our port 3000, would invoke this CORS policy error. So since our backend is running on port 8081, when we're trying to access the backend from the frontend, we're going to get this kind of error saying this has been blocked by CORS policy. So we would have to set the appropriate CORS headers in the request, and we can use a package called /contrib/course. Of course, I'm going to put this in the description box as well. And you can simply copy the first line here to install it. Paste it, enter. And if you scroll down, it's going to show you how you can implement this. So just copy this line here, and we're just going to make small changes to it. Okay, I'm going to save this. It's going to auto import. And here, I'm going to say HTTP localhost 3000. And instead of put and patch, I'm going to say get and post. And for allowing headers, we're going to do content dash type. And here as well, I'm going to change this to localhost 3000, like that. So that's actually it for our backend. We now want to test them out. So I'm going to clear this real quick. cd into our backend and go run main.go. So our endpoints are running on port 8081. I'll be using Postman to test these endpoints. So now that we have everything in place, let's test it out. So I'm going to be passing in this first name, last name, email and password to API/register, send it, and I'm going to have the password encrypted and get this data back in the response. And now if I were to copy the same information and pass it into API/login, just pass in the email and password like this. Since the login was successful, it's going to return that same result in the response. And if you log in, you realize how you have the cookie created for you of name JWT here. So if we actually try to get the user, we're going to get the user except for the password, and we still have the cookie stored. And once we log out, it's going to display the message success, and we're not going to have the cookie anymore. So that's pretty much it for the backend part of this authentication app. In the following part, I'll be creating the front-end part of it using the TypeScript React. I hope you guys found this helpful. Thank you all for watching.